Welcome back for more AP Research. This week we're going to be dealing with biases because after all we all have biases, and one of the things that we try and minimize as much as we can in research is how often you let your biases show. And typically the way that you see it is as shown in this picture. Your bias is usually I have this preconceived notion and that's all I'm going to go with, and I'm not going to allow anything else to make me deviate, even though facts might say otherwise. So again, where are we? So you have your initial question. We've done some background research. We've made our annotated bibliography, which led to our actual research question. Right now, you are still getting approval because some of you are still asking for that, and we're coming up with methods to gather your data, and you're gathering your data. And as you're gathering your data, you're going to have to start to analyze those data, because data is a plural term, not a singular term. And one of the things that's going to start to show up, especially with how you gather your data and the analysis of your data, is bias. So I figured Neil deGrasse Tyson can help us out with this.
How can it be made clear that personal beliefs and public opinions are not the factors that decide the validity of scientific discoveries?
Excellent question. Scientists are human like everybody else. We are trained to minimize the role of our bias in our experiments and in our interpretations. But sometimes that's hard, if not impossible, to do. So while you can have a scientist that falls victim to his or her own biases, sure, and there's many examples of that in the past, but the enterprise of science has built-in error-checking mechanisms. You know what that is? There's somebody else who's checking you, who has a different set of biases or no bias at all. If they get the same result as you, that adds confidence that maybe your result is right in spite of your bias. If they get a different result, either you're wrong, or you're wrong, or both of them are wrong. See, that's what's interesting about science. If you're both saying two different things, you both cannot be right. And the enterprise of science sorts that out, eventually over time, and biases are revealed. And if it is later shown that your bias interfered with your results, your next study will be significantly discounted in people's trust. Okay? It would interfere with your career as a scientist. And this is the value of science as an enterprise, because we know we are, as humans, we are susceptible to bias of all kinds.
So we could probably just exchange the word scientist with researcher, because a lot of research is based upon the way science works. So we all have it. It's just how do you attempt to avoid it? When we do, so an anchoring bias would be when you have information and basically you're just holding on to that information, and that's based, and you're using that information, which is what you want, to warp how you see everything. So you're not looking from multiple perspectives. You found one that you like, and that's all you're seeking. So you could overstate what your results are, which is a bias, because you're saying you're super important. We could be shifting how we speak to each other. So if you're giving interviews, your biases might show up in how you word questions, even though the questions should be worded the same and read the same way, but you actually might inadvertently change how you're acting. You might be fully unaware to look out for certain things because you think that, oh, it doesn't matter to me, but you actually might always have a blind spot towards whatever the subject is. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong during research, especially if we're dealing with people that reveal your biases. So how can we do that? Well, if you're giving a survey, it helps if you have multiple people who are not like you read the survey. And with you there, it's here's how I'm reading this question. And if how that person is reading the question is not how you intended the question, then you need to be changing the question. You don't do this once, you don't do this twice, you do this multiple times. And the whole point of it is to make sure that the questions you're asking have removed as much bias as possible. Meaning, like, you might sit there and say, oh, well, I'll just use all these words and I understand all these words, but people might not know what you're talking about. So you're actually giving a bias and you're actually shifting it so the people who understand your language will do better on it or give a more desired result than maybe those who have no clue what you're talking about. If we're doing comparisons, we need to have controls, but you have to actually figure out what the controls are, or you just flat out admit it. Sometimes you just need to say what your bias is. There's nothing wrong with admitting to things, especially because we're now all fully aware that it's there, and we now take that into consideration when we look at your research. Again, this does happen to show up quite a bit, so the confirmation bias, we do this on the internet where we sit there and you just look for anything that supports your point of view, as opposed to, oh, well, the topic is this. Let me look up whatever the subject is about and find information. Sometimes you want to find contrarian information because it either works or it doesn't. But usually what we think is not necessarily the truth. One of the other things that you need to start worrying about, which we've been working on slowly, but some of you just are resisting turning anything in, is we need to start writing the paper. So this comes straight out of the Practical Research book that I've made reference to several times. They have a very nice little check sheet for here's how you need to write the paper. So if you follow these 7 things, it will help. So it helps if you know who you're writing to, which are people who actually know a little bit of stuff, but they might not know your topic. Be logical, be very clear, use the correct tenses, so don't be switching back and forth between present and past and future and things like that. Try and be impartial, or if you can't be impartial, flat out admit that you can't be impartial. Summarize what you keep saying, it always helps, and follow required formats, meaning if you're writing a paper for psychology, it should follow a psychology paper. If you're writing something about history, it should follow a history paper. If you're writing something about politics, it should follow a political science paper. If you're writing about science, it should follow something about science. If you're writing something about education, it should follow the patterns that we write in education. And how do you know that? You just look at the papers that you've dealt with before. Also, some of you are running into this roadblock, and that is the whole, well, I'm just overwhelmed with the writing. So the first one up there, which is small accomplishable goals, that's why we're writing your paper in steps. Let's write your introductions, and then we'll start writing your methods, and then we'll start working on your results, and then we'll start working about your analyses, and we'll start worrying about what conclusions you can draw. So we're writing this thing over the course of months as opposed to you have a weekend. It's why I keep pestering you, like, turn stuff in, and it's because I'm trying to have you have small goals. Because if we can keep achieving small goals, it will make your life far more simpler. Also, we're going to be going for revisions, and that's the goal. But it only works if you're doing your work.